If this is a linear draw and this is an angular draw, which is better? Now, the next question I have for you is simple. Are you sure about that? You see, linear versus angular draw is one of the most confused debates in the archery coaching community. First of all, the terms are quite imprecise, and they're used inconsistently and inaccurately, even amongst many of the experts. Secondly, you have these debates amongst coaches where some people make really good points very badly, and other people make really bad points sound quite compelling. This leads to a misunderstanding and misapplication of techniques. And as you know, a good technique done badly is worse than even a mediocre technique done well. So in this video, we need to do a few things. First of all, we need to define the terms, guys. We need to define what is a linear draw and what is an angular draw. Then we're going to break down and explain the techniques. We're going to analyze some pros. We're going to look at world-class archers who shoot with a linear draw and an angular draw. And then I'm going to share with you my coaching process for how I teach a linear draw or an angular draw, answering the final question, which is the superior technique. The term angular draw was first introduced and popularized by Coach Keesick Lee in his brilliant book, the second edition of Total Archery. In chapter 10 of this book, he defines a term called angular motion. Angular motion refers to motion about an axis or rotational motion. For example, this is angular motion, this is angular motion, this is angular motion, and this is angular motion. He correctly points out that almost all movements within the body comprise of angular motion. It therefore is implied that in terms of archery technique and biomechanics, what we want to do is we want to create a technique that creates the most efficient and powerful sum of these angular movements within our draw cycle and within our shot process. Now, you'll hear no arguments from me. I 100% agree with this philosophy. Unfortunately, however, in the next chapter, chapter 11, he introduces some terms that are less precisely defined. So the terms angular draw and angular motion seem to be a little bit interchangeable. He goes so far as to define that an angular draw is one which comprises of this rotational movement of the drawing side shoulder, essentially referring to retraction of the drawing side scapula. But there are a couple of problems with this. First of all, this seems to contradict some of the other implications and statements made within the book. This is also not the common understanding of an angular draw, even though this is the source material. And finally, this pretty much defines all shooting styles. Almost all technique coaching doctrines and shooting styles involve retraction of the drawing side scapula. So are they all an angular draw? I don't think so. So we better define this. So it would seem obvious or self-evident that an angular draw is one which uses angular motion. Actually, almost all movements within the body comprise of angular motion. For example, if I move my finger towards you in a straight line like this, my finger might be moving in a straight line or a linear motion. But if you look at it from this angle, this is just a sum of multiple anatomical angular motions within the body. So there's actually no perceivable way you can draw a bow using linear motion or anatomical linear motion. All drawing styles comprise almost exclusively of angular motion. Does that make sense? So it turns out that a linear draw or an angular draw actually refers to the motion of the bow throughout the draw sequence. So here we have an angular and a linear draw. The left-hand side is the angular draw and the right-hand side is the linear draw case. So what I want to point out first of all is that in this position, which you might call the set or the setup position, we have in the linear draw, the bow is pretty much aligned with the target from the beginning. Whereas in the angular draw, the bow is actually open to the target from the setup position. Now, as we proceed through the draw sequence, we have raise and pre-draw. And in this stage, both cases have now achieved shoulder alignment. But what you will notice is that in the linear draw, the bow is still pretty much in line with the target. Whereas for the angular draw, the bow has now rotated. It's much more in line with the target than the setup position. It's not fully aligned just yet though, is it? So let's proceed through to the full draw position. And now what we can see is in the full draw position, for the linear case, it is still in line with the target, as you would expect. And in the angular draw, it has now come into full alignment with the target. So throughout the draw sequence, you can see that in the linear case, the bow stays pretty much in line with the target through the entire draw sequence. Whereas in the angular draw, the bow rotates about a vertical axis throughout the draw sequence, such that it starts open to the target, and then throughout the draw sequence closes until it becomes fully aligned with the target. What I want to point out is that both drawing styles actually have much more in common than they have different. So let me point this out. In both cases, the shoulders begin open to the target during the draw sequence. Now, this is something that you can commonly observe in all drawing styles from all top archers. The first stage of the draw is actually defined by a rotation of the core in which shoulder alignment is achieved. And this is the case in both angular and linear draw. It's defined by that rotation of the core to achieve shoulder alignment, and this is what defines pre-draw position. Now, the second phase of the draw is where, through retraction of the scapula and drawing the drawing side elbow around, we come into full alignment. And you can essentially see that in both cases, they achieve the same position. The difference is kind of how they get there, but the essential fundamentals of technique structure are the same for both linear and angular drawing styles. The first stage of the draw is essentially defined by rotation through the core to achieve shoulder alignment in pre-draw position. And the second phase of the draw is defined by retraction of the drawing side scapula and shoulder extension such that the elbow draws around into that full draw position. And so you can see that in this way, there's actually much more in common between both the drawing styles. They're not totally contrarian to each other. The difference is the angle that the bow takes throughout the drawing style itself. Both styles use anatomical angular motion to get into full draw. So now let's look at some professional archers who shoot with a linear draw and an angular draw and see if we can analyze it and break it down in a bit more detail. Now, the first archer that I want to look at is Brady Ellison. Now, Brady's a good example to follow here because, without a doubt, shoots with an angular draw. He was the most requested when I asked in my followers, who do you think of when you think of an angular draw? It was all Brady Ellison. So here you can see it's actually super obvious in the way that Brady draws his bow. There's a rotation throughout the whole drawing sequence. And from this angle, you can also see that as he comes into anchor, there's that definite rotation, which can be observed in the stabilizer there. As he comes into anchor, it can also be observed in the angle of the sight rail shifting very slightly. You can see that as he comes into anchor. So no arguments, Brady shoots with an angular draw. Miguel Alvarino Garcia, who is a Spanish archer, and he's a World Cup final champion. So he also shoots with quite an angular draw. You can see that throughout his drawing sequence, the bow rotates about that vertical axis in a horizontal plane, and it can be observed in the shift of his stabilizer. And as he draws into anchor, the bow comes in line with the target. Another archer who shoots with an angular draw is Angela Ruiz from Mexico. Now, she's a great young archer, and she also shoots with quite a pronounced angular draw. You can see that as she comes into anchor throughout her drawing sequence, the bow is rotating about that axis, and it's observed quite obviously in the rotation of the stabilizer, and the sight rail shifts as she comes into anchor. Now, all three of these archers shoot with quite an obvious angular draw. So let's now look at some professional archers who shoot with a linear draw. Let's start with Lee Woo-suk. This is a great angle to observe because you can see both the angle of his bow and also the path that his hand follows as he draws into anchor. And you can see that there's really no discernible shift in the angle of the bow throughout the draw sequence. His stabilizer continually points towards the target, and there's no rotation of that riser throughout his draw sequence. Another highly requested archer to look at for a linear draw was Kibo Bay. Now, she's obviously a superstar in archery and Olympic champion from 2012 in the individual women's and teams, of course. And we can see that throughout her draw sequence, she keeps the bow directly in line with the target as well, all the way through the draw. Now, what's interesting, and I'll point out here, is that you can actually see in this angle that to keep the bow in line with the target, she creates a little kink in the wrist there. This is something that you could call anatomically inefficient. But as she comes into full draw, you can see that by coming into alignment, that wrist flattens out. And whilst you might say that it is anatomically inefficient by creating tension in the wrist, you can't really argue with her results. And so you wouldn't exactly say that a linear draw has caused her to have an inconsistent release. Or you would have quite an argument to make if that is what you're saying. So let's now look at Marcus D'Almeida. And he's the current men's world #1 at the time of recording this video. And he also shoots with a linear draw. Or does he? Now, let's look very closely here, because this kind of surprised me, if I'm honest. He was one of the most requested when I asked my followers who should we analyze when looking at a linear draw. But if we define angular draw as rotation of the bow around that vertical axis, let's just look very closely as he comes into anchor. Are you seeing what I'm seeing? Because if so, this is an angular draw. Certainly not as much as some of the other archers we've looked at with Brady Ellison and the like, but there is a definite rotation of the bow. You can see this angle of the sight bar and the stabilizer change as he comes into his anchor position. You can see this again from this angle. Look at the angle of his stabilizer change as he comes into full draw. There's definitely a rotation of the bow throughout his draw sequence. And this kind of surprised me, is that when I started looking at archers, and many of the archers who were requested by you guys, my followers, when I said I was researching this video, when I started looking at them, I started getting surprised. So one of the archers that I wanted to use as an example of shooting with a linear draw was Lisa Barbelin from France. She's someone who shoots with quite a linear draw. However, when you look closely, you can actually see that there is a degree of angularity to her draw. You can see here the angle of the bow changes as she comes into anchor. It's really hard sometimes to pick up with these panning camera angles. You can see it here as well. If you just look very carefully at the angle of the riser here, even you can just observe the angle of the tiller bolts shift as she comes into anchor position. And so it's not always as obvious as you may immediately think. Kim Woo-jin, right? Shoots with a linear draw, would you say? Well, let's take a look. So here you can see there's a bit of camera movement, unfortunately, but here you can definitely see, look at the angle of the stabilizer and the angle of the bow as he comes into draw. There is a definite rotation of that bow as he comes into full draw. And here again, you can see, unfortunately, these camera angles are not ideal because there's actually camera movement as well as the bow movement, but you can definitely see the angle of the bow, the angle of the stabilizer, and the sight shifts as he comes into draw. Guys, tell me if I'm missing something obvious here, but that's an angular draw. So I was actually quite surprised when I started breaking down the form from all the pro archers, because I thought that there were going to be archers who shoot with a linear draw, and there were going to be archers who shoot with an angular draw. And there certainly are. However, almost everyone shoots somewhere in that middle ground where it's not, say, fully angular or fully linear, but there's a degree of angularity to their draw. And it actually varies pretty significantly from archer to archer to archer. And what I found is that most pro archers fit somewhere on that spectrum. And there are cases you can point out to of all different levels of angularity in the draw. So I did actually a much more detailed technical breakdown from many more of the professional archers, and I'll make that available through Rogue Archery behind the scenes, and I'll link that down below in a much more comprehensive form breakdown. So as we can see from analyzing some of the pro archers, there are elite world-class archers shooting with both a linear draw and an angular draw. So if you have strong opinions about which is the master race, linear draw or angular draw, you're wrong, at least some of the time. What we need to do is we need to explore the nuance of these techniques. And instead of asking ourselves which technique is better, you need to ask yourself, which technique is better for me? We need to break down the pros and cons and then implementation methods for teaching both the linear and angular draw. When it comes to the linear draw, there is a very simple benefit to the linear draw. That is, it's simple. You see, a linear draw, drawing in line to the target with the bow, is actually very intuitive. And that means that archers will naturally adopt a linear draw unless they are taught otherwise. There are, however, a couple of drawbacks, excuse the pun, from a linear draw. And spoiler alert, they don't apply equally to everyone. The first one is wrist tension. And you see, in order to keep the bow in line to the target, you have to introduce this kink in the wrist when going from set or setup position through the draw sequence. This introduces a thing called tension bias. And tension bias is an anatomical term where once tension is introduced in a muscle, so in this case, the wrist extensors, that tension will remain whilst the load is applied. This means that even though the wrist flattens out as you come into a full alignment, the tension in the muscles will remain, and this can lead to a loss of consistency in the release and plucking of the release. The second drawback from a linear draw is risk of impingement on the drawing side bicep tendon, or the long head of biceps. Now, I've done a whole video on a spotlight on the impingement of the bicep tendon, so I'll link that up here somewhere, and please go check that out for more detail. But in a simple terms, when you draw in a linear fashion to keep this bow in line, you actually create a slightly more acute angle with the shoulder joint here, which can increase the risk of injury on that long head of biceps. So what I think is really important to acknowledge at this stage is that the two issues with a linear draw, wrist tension and bicep tendon injury, don't apply equally to everyone. And it has to do with your body proportions. You see, someone who, say, has a more slender build and longer limbs actually doesn't have these issues as much. Let me try and explain. With a more slender build, these archers can reach further forward in the set or the setup position and don't have to introduce as much tension into the wrist to keep the bow in line. Whereas if you have broader shoulders, to get to this position, you actually have to open your shoulders more to the target in this position. And that means that you have to create more wrist tension, and that exacerbates the issue with the wrist tension and tension bias in the release. Similarly, same issue with the impingement of the bicep tendon, and this typically applies to the angle of the shoulder in the pre-draw position. So pre-draw is the stage where you've already set your posture, you've achieved shoulder alignment through rotation of the core, okay? And you've set the front shoulder and the front arm. But in this position to keep the bow in line, this is where it actually creates a bit more of an acute angle with the shoulder here. So archers who have longer limbs tend to have less of this issue. Archers who have broader shoulders tend to create a slightly more acute angle on the shoulder, and this also makes them more prone to that risk of bicep tendinitis. So as we can see, there are a couple of benefits from adopting a more angular draw style, and they're the inverse of the drawbacks from the linear draw. So primarily, adopting an angular draw sequence allows us to create a straight line, a line of force from the pressure point through the hook, through the wrist, and to the drawing side elbow, and then maintain that through the entire draw sequence. Okay, and that is more biomechanically efficient, and it prevents us from adding unnecessary tension into the wrist, and simultaneously reduces the risk of inflammation of that biceps tendon. Now, this is my interpretation of Kiesikli's teachings in terms of an angular draw, and to me, this makes sense. It's congruent that drawing the bow in an angular motion simultaneously optimizes the anatomical angular motion within our draw sequence. So let me know in the comments section below if you agree with this interpretation and the application of this technique. Now, with that being said, there are a couple of issues that I see with the angular draw. Now, I want to be very clear here that the theory of an angular draw is very sound, and the problems that I see tend to be more with the implementation of this technique rather than with the technique itself. Let me explain. Adopting an angular draw requires a high degree of spatial awareness, both in the coach teaching it and in the archer adopting it. So for example, throughout the draw sequence, you are raising the bow on an angle, and then simultaneously the angle of the bow is changing throughout the draw sequence. So if the archer does not anchor their center of balance and posture correctly with the ground and the target, then what we tend to see is archers losing their weight distribution and center of balance, and if their posture is not solid, this goes all over the place, and they end up shooting like a palm tree in the wind, and this obviously undoes any benefit from adopting an angular draw, a more efficient draw style. So good technique fundamentals, postural stability, weight distribution, obviously are critical for any drawing style, but tends to be more difficult, I find, with particularly developing archers when they're learning this for the first time. So that needs to be an emphasis. The second thing that makes it difficult to teach and adopt for archers is the spatial awareness of the changing angle of the bow, and in particular, synchronizing your aiming pattern with your drawing sequence. So, by nature of the angular draw, where the angle of the bow is changing through the draw sequence, the sight rail is an extension on the riser and the direction the bow is pointing, which means that as the angle of the bow changes, the sight has a lateral shift in towards the target. Now, if you do not synchronize this aiming pattern into your draw sequence, what this means is as you're coming into anchor, what's commonly observed is the sight pin will come offline, and then the archer has to make corrections during their shot. This means that it's very, very difficult for them to maintain a strong directional expansion when their sight pin's shifting this way and they're simultaneously bringing it back the other direction. They lose postural stability, they lose power through the execution, and their directional expansion, as I said, is all over the place. This leads to extremely poor consistency and grouping on the target. For this reason, I think that a key element to adopting the angular draw effectively is to learn how to synchronize your aiming pattern with your unique drawing style. Now, that's too much of a topic to cover in depth in this video, but for my masterclass students, I have done a whole video, which is a live demonstration going through the drill we use for each archer to synchronize their aiming pattern with their unique drawing style. So I'll link that up below and you can check that out as well. So now that we've identified the linear draw, the angular draw, what they are, how they work, I want to take a moment to address some of the myths and misconceptions associated with these techniques. Now, the first myth that I want to bust open is that the angular draw is synonymous with the NTS or the KSL shot cycle. Now, it's actually pretty obvious why this would be interpreted as the case, because Coach Lee was the guy who coined the term angular draw. However, just by analyzing archers with different drawing and shooting styles, we quickly see that there are plenty of archers who shoot with an angular draw or a level of angularity into their draw, and not just archers who follow the NTS or the KSL shot cycle. The next most common myth with an angular draw and a linear draw is that the Korean archers all shoot with a linear draw. Now, actually, 2 out of 3 of the men on the Tokyo Olympics gold medal winning team shoot with an angular draw. Oh Jin-hyuk definitely breaks the mold for conventional shooting technique, and he shoots with an angular draw. And also Kim Woo-jin shoots with an angular drawing style. What's interesting about him is that throughout his career, he seems to have started early career with quite a linear drawing style, and it has now become more angular throughout his career. I'd be very curious as to why that is. Interestingly, also the third team member, which is Kim Jae-hyuk, who shoots with a linear draw, quite a linear draw, is very different in build to these two gentlemen. So Kim Woo-jin and Oh Jin-hyuk, very broad in terms of their shoulders and adopt a slightly angular draw, whereas Kim Jae-hyuk is quite slender and has longer limbs. And so for him, that would seem to confirm our theory around the benefits of a slightly more angular draw suiting those more stockier, broader individuals. Now, I think that this myth seems to be a perpetuation of the stereotype that the Korean archers all roll off the same assembly line. And maybe there's some history to this. However, my experience in Korea has not been this at all. And whilst the Korean coaches and the Korean coaching doctrine certainly has a strong foundation of technique fundamentals, I think my experience talking with Korean coaches and Korean archers has been that the best Korean coaches are experts at working with individual athletes, certainly at the higher levels of development, and working in their unique attributes into their shooting style. The next myth is that an open stance is synonymous with an angular draw and a square stance is synonymous with a linear draw. This is actually not true. It's possible to do a linear or angular draw with either. Now, I've done a much more detailed breakdown on a square and open stance in the stance module of the Rogue Archery Masterclass, including the benefits and drawbacks of each and why you might want to shoot one over the other. Now, that is a paid program, but I'll link that down below for anyone who wants to check it out. So the final myth that I definitely want to bust open is that more angular is more better. And this is obviously not the case. You could say there's a benefit from going from a completely linear draw to an angular draw where you create a direct line of force from the pressure point through the hook, through the wrist, and to the elbow. And that line is maintained throughout the draw sequence. However, going further than that and even more angular just introduces the problem in the other direction. You see, you could say that a linear draw introduces tension into the wrist extensors, and so that can create tension bias and inconsistency in the release. But simultaneously, going too angular is going to introduce tension into the wrist flexors, and that just creates similar sort of issues. This also seems to be aligned with a lot of the problems that people point out in this discourse around linear versus angular drawing styles. People tend to point out not issues with angular draw, but the issues with the implementation of angular draw. And this is where I think it is key to have an understanding of the technique and also the application of the technique. So what I feel is key to implementing the angular draw is a simplification of the technique. In terms of when to introduce the angular draw, it generally presents in the archer's development once they are a development level archer where they already have a sound basis of the shot process reinforced. At this stage, it is usually identified as something to address when they're in the process of building up their arrow volume while simultaneously increasing their bow fitness and increasing their shooting poundage. This is when the benefits of adopting an angular draw seem to be the highest. Now, once an archer is identified as being a potential and of potentially benefiting from adopting an open draw, the way they are instructed is that in the setup position, or set position you may call it, we instruct them to open the bow to create a straight line from the pressure point to the hook, through the wrist, to the elbow. So that opens the bow in the setup position. This angle is then maintained through the raise of the bow, and then from raise to pre-draw, where pre-draw is the stage where we align our shoulders with the target. The bow is half closed. It's not yet in line, but it comes more in line than from the raised position. And then as they come into anchor, using a retraction of that drawing side scapula and drawing the elbow around into full alignment, that is where the bow comes in line with the target for execution. Once we have that draw sequence reinforced, typically with a flex band or a training bow, we'll get the archer to reinforce that at blank butt, so no targets and no aiming focus within their shot cycle. And from there, we will introduce a nice, big, comfy looking target at close distance, and then teach the archer through a drill to synchronize their aiming pattern with their draw sequence. Once they have that under control, it's then their job to obviously go away and reinforce that drawing technique, maintain their posture, their fundamentals, their whole shot process, whilst implementing the angular draw as a technical advantage on their previous shot process. And I've got to say, we've had a lot of success using this method with both regional, national champions and national representatives with a very quick learning curve that doesn't require a whole process change. It's just an advancement on their technical progressions. So if you find yourself in a debate about linear draw versus angular draw, I recommend that you send the person this video and then change the topic to something less controversial, like politics. But essentially, there's a few things I hope we can agree on. The first one is that all styles of shooting incorporate anatomical angular motion. Secondly, if we look at some of the best archers in the world, some of them shoot with a linear draw, some of them shoot with an angular draw, and most of them actually shoot somewhere in the middle with a degree of angularity to their draw, not perfectly linear or fully angular. There are two key benefits to adopting an angular draw. One, reducing tension bias in the drawing side wrist. This is going to help improve consistency in the release. The second benefit is minimize the risk of impingement on the drawing side bicep tendon, the long head of biceps, and I've done a whole video on this that you should check out if you're presenting with early onset overuse injury of the long head of biceps. The correct time to implement an angular draw is to address one or both of these issues. This means that there is some judgment required and some coaching discretion as to when and how angular the draw needs to be for the individual archer. Couple of things, guys. First of all, I hope you enjoy these detailed technical breakdowns on specific topics. If you do, you can support the channel by liking and subscribing to the video. And I've got two treats for you. One, I have a weekly mailing list where I send out a live coaching demonstration. This is a practical video from my coaching academy where I'm giving either a live demonstration or physically coaching someone, or it's some sort of live presentation of a workshop or something like that. I send out an exclusive video every single week to that mailing list. I'll link that down below. It's Rogue Archery behind the scenes, and it's completely free. You can go and access that now and start to get those weekly emails coming through. Free videos, go do it. The second thing you can do is if you really want to level up archery, then I obviously have my full coaching curriculum. And that's where I take you through the entire shot process from start to finish. We analyze the technique fundamentals, which as we discussed, are the non-negotiables that the top archers all implement. We run you through the Rogue Archery shot process as I teach it, and go through the drills, the exercises, the coaching interventions, and show you how to minimize your learning curve and prevent making some of the mistakes that hold archers back from achieving their full potential in their archery career. Honestly, I created that resource because I wanted to create something that I wish was there for me 15 years ago. And I'm absolutely stoked with the kind of results we're getting from students in that program, and the feedback that I've gotten from that course has been just outstanding. So at least go check it out, and I hope to see you there. Cheers.